Let's talk about catch cans for a minute here, because catch cans are something that are very commonly overlooked in the 300ZXs. I don't quite get it, honestly, because when people get 300ZXs, that's probably one of the last things they think about. But you buy a Subaru, you get an EJ25, and it's like the first thing that everyone goes to and rants and raves about is you need an air oil separator or a catch can on your Subaru. However, you get 300ZX, nobody talks about that. Why is that? Let's cover that today in this video, because there are a couple things and I can think of a couple reasons as to why that may be. Number one being that, well, obviously 300ZXs don't necessarily suffer the same fate as a lot of Subarus with the EJ25s do. Now in today's video, we're going to be going over why you need a catch can or an air oil separator, the difference between the two, and their functions collectively and individually. Now, just for illustration purposes, this is the catch can that I am using in my 300ZX. It is honestly one of the cheapest ones you could probably get off Amazon, and I know quite a few other high horsepower 300ZXs, one of them being probably the fastest street chassis 300ZX in the world, using that same catch can, or at least he was using the same catch can. Now obviously you don't need the fanciest one out there on the market. Each one has its own features as well as flaws. Some fewer than others, but obviously with them you get what you pay for. Being that I got the cheapest one out there, I certainly got the bare minimum of what is needed for a catch can. Okay, so the basic function of a catch can or an air oil separator is to basically collect all of the crankcase gases that are blown up into, well, the crankcase. And you might ask, well, what is the crankcase? The crankcase is basically everything in the bottom end of the motor that is not in necessarily the combustion area of the cylinder. So we're talking about the crankshaft, the pistons, the rods, all of that combined equals the crankcase. Catch cans and air oil separators are most commonly found on turbo vehicles, and the reason for that is because they experience typically higher cylinder pressures. You typically don't get high cylinder pressures without having a lot of high horsepower, and with high horsepower typically means you're running a lot of boost. Now on a factory car, is a catch can or air oil separator going to help? Probably not. I wouldn't worry about it unless you've got a Subaru. Subarus, for some reason, well, at least from my knowledge, back in the day, they would detonate primarily on the number 3 or number 4 cylinders. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. And the reason for that was because a lot of the oil would get sucked up from the crankcase and get blown back into the intake manifold. However, it would get blown back into the intake manifold via the number 4 intake runner. And with that, the number 4 or 3 cylinder would see the most detonation because it would see the most heat and coking from the oil in that intake, and ultimately cause ringland failure from all of the detonation to that cylinder. Now, if anybody wants to hop in the comments and correct me if I'm wrong, that is my best explanation of what I currently understand of the Subaru situation. One could say that 300ZX, in many ways, I think, could suffer the same fate, because I remember back in the day, the 300ZX having issues with the number 5 and 6 cylinders. In the basic form, a catch can catches all of the extra crankcase pressure, gases, oils, everything that gets blown up out of the oiling system. All that excess pressure needs somewhere to go. And well, from the factory, it typically gets pushed right back into the intake tract, which causes a lot of oil buildup and sludge and just nasty things in your intake manifold and intake valves that you really don't want. So with the catch can, it's kind of, well, collecting all of that and not allowing it to get sucked back into the motor. But what exactly is blow-by, you might ask? Well, for instance, blow-by is caused by excess cylinder pressure leaking by the piston rings. Now, you might think, oh, but Billy, isn't that a bad thing? Doesn't that lower your compression? Well, to some extent, yes. A little bit of blow-by is perfectly normal and actually good for your motor. Too much, however, you're probably due for a rebuild. I know for a while the PCV ports were something that was more of a common delete on the 300ZX, and in all honesty, my opinion, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. If you're not having any problems with your PCV, don't worry about it, leave it in. And seriously though, the PCV system on the 300ZX, and like most cars, is really a very straightforward system. Now, give me a minute, because if you're with 300ZXs or you come from the Nissan or Toyota background, you may have never even heard of an AOS. And for those of you who don't know what an AOS is, bear with me because I'm getting there. We're gonna go over that. However, I'm gonna be honest, I don't have one here with me, so I won't be able to take it apart and show you, but don't worry, there are plenty of videos out there already that I've found where they pull the AOS apart and explain in detail just exactly how they function. So without having one on site, I will do my best to explain to you guys how an AOS works. This is a spare motor I just got laying around. I'm sorry, my actual intake manifold is kind of stuffed away in the back corner over here, and I'm not about to go fish that out right now. It's a complete headache back there. It's a mess back there. Not even gonna go get into that. So back here, if you look on this port, this is where the PCV runs into. So the PCV on the intake manifold, which should be sitting across here, the PCV valve comes out right here and goes straight into here. On the breather ports, however, this breather port also runs back along and then down into an intake pipe. Very important to know the difference between breather ports and PCV because, well, there's a lot of vacuum or lack thereof going on with those. I left this port and the PCV on the intake manifold alone on my factory setup, and I only ran my catch can off of this hose here and this hose over here. The reason for that is, well, was it the most efficient? Probably not, because let me explain. So the PCV functions primarily when the car is in a vacuum, which is at idle or when you're at decel. Then when you're at wide open throttle with little to no vacuum, actually you're in positive pressure at that point, the PCV valves are closed, which means this port back here is not doing anything, which means the breather ports are doing work at that point in time. The best way I can explain it is the breather ports function at wide open throttle and the PCV functions at idle or off throttle in decel. So basically, with the stock intake manifold setup, you have a PCV valve here and a PCV valve here. The one on this side simply goes straight into here. The one on this side runs back along to all these fancy piping and all that useless stuff in the back of the motor back here, and typically ends up right here. So for some reason, both the PCVs end up on the driver's side exhaust valve. Why that is, I do not know, but my suggestion, just leave the PCVs alone and only work with the breather ports, at least on the 300ZX. On a lot of motors, actually, that might be your best option, but there's other ways to get around that. Although I will say, sometimes it's best to put a little bit of a vacuum on your catch can. Okay, so this is my $50 battery catch can from Amazon. You can still get these, I believe, for about $50, maybe even $70 now, you know, inflation and that whole thing, so it might have gone up a little bit, but these used to be about $50. There are 2 ventilation ports on the top, which I put breather filters on, and then there's 4 ports on the side. If you really wanted to, you could run 2 to your breather and 2 to the PCV valves, although that probably wouldn't work because the PCV in essence needs to go back into the intake manifold. And the reason for that is because, well, the computer is actually calibrated to get a vacuum through the PCV valve. So if you close up that vacuum, well, the computer is not going to know where to look. It's going to say, hey, I'm missing some airflow. What's going on here? So be careful about the ports you plug up on your PCV and intake track because, well, that could ultimately affect your tune and drivability of the vehicle in general. Probably something you don't want to do. Granted, I have this running just to the breather ports on this motor. I ran the exact same thing on my factory intake manifold with my original valve covers. I ran the breather ports off the front of the motor right behind the throttle body to the 2 ports right here on this catch can. It was a very simple setup. It worked for the most part. It is actually currently working. If you guys can really see in there or not, ooh, there we go. It's tough to see. And for the first time, I might actually need to drain this out because the car is making some power at this point. We got a lot of cylinder pressure, which means a lot of blow by, and it's pushing some nasty oily E85 stuff into here. Now, what is an AOS? An air oil separator, you might ask. Well, good thing you asked, because an air oil separator is also something that can be used on more than just a Subaru. Granted, the Subarus could probably use it the most because honestly, you guys are gonna get mad about this, but I'm sure there are a lot more Subaru STIs out there that see track time over 300ZXs. It's the cold hard truth. Honestly, there's just more STIs out there in general. So with that, I'm sure they're gonna see more track time overall. Now, the thing with track time and an air oil separator is that the air oil separator is actually able to separate the oil from the crankcase gases and allow the oil to drain back into the oil sump of the motor. Because when you're going round and round and round around the track in turns and got all this crankcase pressure and blow by going on with your Subaru or 300ZX or whatever high horsepower car you might be pushing around the track, well, if the catch can's catching all the oil, then your oil sump is losing oil, which means you could run dry to all of your bearings and very important components within your motor, which you really don't want to do. So an air oil separator will actually separate the gas vapors from the oil and allow the oil to drain back into the oil sump, which will in the long run keep your engine from running dry of oil, which is obviously not a good thing. So with all that said, if you are going to track your 300ZX around the track, like you're gonna be doing hot laps in it, and you see 15, 20 plus PSI of boost, I would highly recommend running in AOS. If you are not going to regularly check your oil after every few laps around the track, because, I mean, let's be honest, some of these motors just have a lot of blow by. It's inherent of how they are built. The thing that really gets me about the 300ZXs is, for some reason, this has kind of just been like blown off as like they don't need it. And as a matter of fact, I remember years ago, PCV deletes was a thing, and I would not recommend it. I personally do not like excess crankcase pressure in my car. As a matter of fact, if it was easy enough, I would probably install a PCV system into the motor that I have. However, I would have to adjust my tune, I would have to run new piping, find some more fittings. It would just be more work than what it's worth. And you might ask, but Billy, how does an AOS actually separate the gas vapors from the oil? Well, there are different levels to these things. Obviously, this is not an AOS, it is simply a catch can. Catch cans come in varying levels themselves. Some have baffles in them, which is literally just, well, extra sheets of metal at a staggering height, or some of them even have just holes drilled in them to not allow any slosh or anything like that to get flung back out when you take a turn or accelerate really hard. However, I will say this cheap one doesn't have any baffling. But like I said, you do what you pay for. And so far this has worked out okay for me. Now in AOS on the other hand, those can get very complex, because what an AOS actually does to separate the gas vapors from the oil is many of them, most of them, actually have coolant pipes running into the AOS to a heater block to heat up a side of the AOS. And what that does is that actually separates and keeps the gas vapors hot enough so that they continue to flow out of the AOS and not stay trapped in it, in which case the oil then sinks to the bottom and then drains out of it. Pretty cool idea if you ask me, and that's kind of the rough gist of it. Now there are some really high quality ones out there, like the IAG. They get very expensive very quickly. It all depends on what you want to do with the car. For me, this car is mostly a street car. It sees very little track. I do plan to bring it out there at some point, and if it ever comes to it, well, I'll buy an AOS. However, for right now, this catch can that only cost me $50 is doing everything I need it to, and I'll empty it out maybe once every 6 months, depending on how hard and how often I drive the car. Also, if you're just doing quarter-mile drag passes, like, you may not need to empty this out, but every 3 to 4 times at the track, depending on how much blow-by your motor actually has. Now, if you look at my breather setup here, my catch can setup has the 2 hoses on the top. The reason for that is, well, because if I had it down here, a little bit of slosh and all that oil would be going right back into the motor. What's the point of it at that time? The other option that you could do is put one hose up here, one down here, and probably run this port here as like a vacuum port. And the reason you would want vacuum on this, not necessarily that it would be sucking directly out of here, but remember you have the 2 breather filters up top. So with the breather filters up here and a vacuum port here, you'd essentially have a light vacuum on this system that would constantly be sucking the extra oil out of your crankcase. Be a really good idea, and probably something that I've been meaning to do or think about at the very least. Honestly, that would probably be the best setup, is to have a little bit of vacuum on your catch can, if at all possible. Now, another very important note is if you're running E85 in your car, especially if you're running like 15 plus PSI boost, which I'm sure most people that switch over to E85 at that point are running 15 plus PSI boost. Highly recommend running a catch can. And the reason for that is because E85 for some reason has, well, excess blow by. And this isn't just me saying this. This is just something that it's kind of just commonly known. And why is this, you might ask? Well, I mean, you're injecting 30% more fuel into the cylinder to make the same amount of power, although it has higher knock resistance, which, well, that's a whole other topic for another day. Now, I'm sure you've heard that you need to change your oil more often if you run E85. And the reason for that is because, well, E85 has excessive cylinder washdown, or blow-by also, which basically means that E85 sinks its way down into the oil much more than regular pump octane does. Why is this? Well, I think it's just the inherent nature of E85 in the way that it needs to be ran in the motor. If you've ever pulled your dipstick and you're like, oh wow, this smells like fuel, or this smells like ethanol, you probably might be due for an oil change at the very least, because what E85 will do is actually water down your oil, and then it's not that 20W50 like you put in it to begin with. It actually lightens it to like, well, a 5W20, or you might see your oil pressure start to drop because, well, at that point, probably 20% of your oil is now mixed with ethanol, and you're having all this mixture going on in your crankcase, and it's not good. Just trust me on this. If you're running E85, definitely recommend using a catch can in your car. Now, can I honestly say that I've seen 300ZXs with engine failure caused because they did not have a catch can in their car? No, I can't honestly say that that's what actually happened, but I think it has in the past. And in all honesty, if you're tracking your car with a factory oil sump of only like 3.5 to 4 quarts, you're riding a fine line of, well, if that oil gets too low and it sloshes one corner really hard, then you're gonna run your motor dry of oil for a solid 2 to 3 seconds, which may not destroy your motor at that moment, but it'll definitely harm your motor over time, especially if you do multiple laps. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's been a hot topic that I've been meaning to do. It's just a tough one to put into video format because, well, let's be honest. Talking about catch cans and oil drainage isn't the most exciting thing that we can do for our cars. However, it is definitely something that is overlooked in the 300ZX community, and I hope this brings it to light for a lot of you. But anyways, that's gonna do it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Take care.